In 1824, a paper was published in one of the most respected scientific journals in Europe. It described cities on the moon. The author was Franz von Gruithuysen, not a fringe thinker, not an amateur with a second-hand lens, but a professor at the University of Munich, a trained physician, a meticulous observer who had spent thousands of hours at his telescope before he wrote a single word of what he saw. The paper passed peer review. It was published by an institution that had been adjudicating serious science for over a century. Other astronomers across Europe read it, pointed their own instruments at the region he described near the crater Schroeter, and confirmed the observations. Linear features, geometric patterns, structures with regularity that geological processes don't produce. Nobody laughed at him. That's the part the history books leave out. They didn't laugh. They published. Because in 1824, there was no institutional consensus telling astronomers what the moon was supposed to look like. There was only what you saw when you put your eye to the glass, and what Gruithuysen saw, what Herschel saw, what Schroeter saw, what dozens of professional observers across 4 decades saw, was a moon that modern astronomy says was never there. So let's ask the question almost nobody asks. Not, were they wrong? That's too easy, too comfortable, and it skips the part that actually matters. The question is, who decided they were wrong? When did that decision happen? And what was built to make sure the question was never seriously asked again? Before we get there, let me be direct about where this video stands. The position here is not that the moon has cities. The position is that between roughly 1880 and 1895, a set of institutional structures was built that redefined what counted as a valid astronomical observation, and that those structures, not better instruments, not corrected science, not natural intellectual progress, are what ended the anomalous observation era. That's a specific claim. It's a claim built on the publication record, the founding dates of astronomical societies, and the documented shift in what got printed and what got dismissed. You can disagree with it. The comment section exists for that reason. But the evidence for it is not vague, and it doesn't require believing anything conspiratorial. It requires reading exactly what happened in 15 years of institutional history that mainstream astronomy has very little interest in discussing. Let's start with what the telescopes were actually showing. William Herschel discovered Uranus. That sentence needs to land before anything else, because what follows is going to sound difficult to accept, and the credibility of the person who said it matters. Herschel was not a man who made things up. He was not credulous. He had built, personally, more telescopes than almost any astronomer in history, grinding the mirrors himself, testing their accuracy obsessively, spending years calibrating instruments before he trusted them for serious observation. When he reported something, it was because he had checked it. Repeatedly, he reported lights moving across the dark side of the moon. He reported surface features that changed faster than geological processes could account for. He documented what he described as forested regions, patches of darker material that shifted with what appeared to be a seasonal pattern. His son, John Herschel, continued the observations, reached the same conclusions, published them. The scientific community of the early 19th century did not dismiss him. John Herschel was arguably the most respected scientist in Britain during his lifetime. When he said he saw something, the Royal Astronomical Society listened, and here is what the official narrative does with this. It calls it primitive. It calls the instruments insufficient, the methods unsound, the observers well-meaning, but ultimately mistaken. It frames the entire era of pre-1880 astronomical observation as a kind of extended prologue to real science, charming, understandable given the era, but fundamentally unreliable. That framing has one significant problem. The telescopes were extraordinary. The achromatic refractors being used by Herschel, by Gruithuysen, by Schroeter, by Schiaparelli, these were built by craftsmen whose names are still studied by optical engineers today: Fraunhofer, Merz, Cauchois, Dollond. The instruments that came out of their workshops were not approximations. They were precision devices, built to tolerances that remain impressive by modern standards. Some of them still exist. You can look through them. Their optics are, in many cases, essentially perfect for the task they were designed for. The claim that these telescopes were producing systematic distortions, generating the same false features in the same locations, independently, across different countries, different designs, different magnifications, different atmospheric conditions, is not a scientific explanation. It's a dismissal dressed up as one. Now let's talk about Mars, because the Mars observations are where the institutional machinery becomes visible. In 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli published detailed maps of the Martian surface. Schiaparelli was the director of the Brera Observatory in Milan. He was not prone to speculation. He was the kind of scientist who measured things carefully, published carefully, and chose his words carefully, which is why, when he described hundreds of linear features crossing the Martian surface in organized patterns, the word he used was canali, channels, a geological term, a term that makes no claim about origin or intent. English-speaking journalists turned canali into canals. That translation has been used ever since to dismiss everything that followed as the romantic fantasy of people who wanted Mars to have civilizations. But Schiaparelli's original observations don't require civilization. They require an explanation. And for decades, the observations were confirmed. Percival Lowell built an entire observatory in Arizona, the Lowell Observatory, which still stands, specifically to study Martian features. He spent 15 years mapping what he documented as more than 700 linear structures. Henri Perrotin observed them independently from Nice. Edward Barnard confirmed features from the Lick Observatory. William Pickering saw them from Jamaica. These were not the same observer with the same instrument, having the same hallucination. They were different people, in different countries, using different telescopes, pointing at the same thing and seeing the same thing. After Lowell died in 1916, the erasure began. By the 1920s, the canali observations were being framed as observer error. By the 1950s, they were cautionary tales, cited in textbooks about the dangers of expectation contaminating observation. When Mariner 4 returned its images in 1965, showing a Mars without visible linear features, the case was declared closed. The astronomers had been wrong. Mars was dead. But here's what that timeline actually shows. It doesn't show an error being corrected. It shows a consensus being built, over 50 years, through institutional channels, before the first probe ever flew past Mars, and then a probe result being used to retroactively validate a conclusion that had already been decided. Schiaparelli was a trained engineer before he was an astronomer. He specifically designed his observation protocols to distinguish real surface features from optical artifacts. He used multiple telescopes. He compared observations across opposition cycles. He measured, triangulated, and documented. The possibility that he was simply fooling himself across 15 years of meticulous work, while independent observers in 3 countries fooled themselves in exactly the same way, is not the simplest explanation for what happened. It is the most convenient one. There's something you should understand right now, at roughly the 40% mark of this video, because it's the thing a certain kind of viewer is going to push back on in the comments within hours of this going live. The pushback is going to say, this is the sunk cost fallacy applied to wrong science. People believed in bloodletting too. Being meticulous doesn't make you right. The probes went to Mars. There are no canals. And that pushback is reasonable. It deserves a direct answer, not a hedge. Here is the answer. The probes are not the problem. The problem is the 50-year process of institutional dismissal that preceded the probes, the active reframing of valid, documented, peer-reviewed observations as mass delusion before any probe had gone anywhere, driven not by new evidence, but by the preferences of newly formed professional organizations that needed to establish what serious astronomy looked like. The probes confirmed that Mars, as currently observed, does not show the features Schiaparelli mapped. That's accurate. What the probes cannot tell us is whether Schiaparelli was observing something correctly or incorrectly, because a probe that arrives 100 years after the observation and finds nothing cannot determine what was there when the observation was made. It can only tell us what is there now. That's a meaningful distinction, and it's the distinction the official narrative systematically refuses to make. You're probably somewhere you didn't expect to spend this much time today. That means you're the kind of person this channel exists for. The Grufeisen paper was never formally retracted. That's the detail that lands hardest when you go looking for it, because you expect it to have been retracted. You expect the record to show some formal institutional process, a committee, a review, a documented finding that the 1824 observations were in error, signed by people whose names you can look up. There is no such document. The paper didn't get retracted. It got uncited. It simply stopped appearing in the reference lists of subsequent papers. The observation record it contributed to stopped being discussed. And because science builds on citations, a finding that stops being cited stops, for all practical purposes, existing. That is not how scientific errors are supposed to be corrected. Scientific errors are corrected through documented refutation, through published papers that identify the specific flaw in the methodology, present counter-evidence, and establish on the record why the previous finding cannot be trusted. That process exists for a reason. It creates accountability. It forces whoever is doing the correcting to actually engage with what they're dismissing. What happened to the anomalous astronomical observation record between 1880 and 1895 was not refutation, it was abandonment. And abandonment, unlike refutation, leaves no fingerprints. Let's talk about the 15 years that changed everything. Something shifted. Not in the telescopes stayed the same. Not in the sky. The planets continued behaving as they always had. What shifted was institutional. The British Astronomical Association was founded in 1890. The Astronomical Society of the Pacific began in 1889. The American Astronomical Society was established in 1899. In continental Europe, similar organizations were forming over the same period. Within roughly 15 years, astronomy went from a field practiced by individuals and small independent groups to a profession with formal structures, journals with editorial boards, training programs with standardized curricula, professional credentials that determined whose observations got taken seriously and whose didn't. Before these organizations existed, the peer review of astronomical observations worked through informal networks, observers corresponding across national borders, comparing notes, confirming or questioning each other's findings through direct instrument-to-instrument comparison. It was messy and slow. It also had no gatekeepers. After these organizations formed, it had gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers had a model of the solar system, a clean model, a model where the moon was a dead, cratered rock, Mars was a barren desert, and Venus was hidden beneath impenetrable clouds. A model that matched, not coincidentally, what could be confirmed by the instruments and techniques being standardized in the training programs these organizations controlled. The observations that didn't fit the model didn't get refuted. They stopped getting submitted. And when they did get submitted, they stopped getting published. This is the mechanism. Not a conspiracy, not a secret society making telescopes disappear in the night, an institutional infrastructure that redefined valid observation to match a predetermined conclusion, and then trained every subsequent generation of astronomers to see the solar system through that definition. Here's the observation that should stay with you long after this video ends. Between 1830 and 1879, professional astronomers across Europe and North America, in at least 6 countries, using instruments from dozens of different makers, working completely independently, reported the same anomalous features in the same locations, on the Moon, on Mars, on Venus. Not similar features, the same features, Gruithuysen's lunar structures appeared where Herschel had observed them. Schiaparelli's Martian channels appeared where Lowell would later map them. Arago's Venus surface patterns were confirmed by other French observers, then by British observers, then by German observers. That level of consistency, across that many independent observations, in that many different countries, is not what mass hallucination looks like. Mass hallucination doesn't produce coordinates. It doesn't produce independently verified measurements. It doesn't produce observation journals whose drawings, when compared side by side, show the same features at the same latitudes with the same orientations. What that level of consistency looks like is a real thing that many people were accurately recording. And then it looks like a real thing that stopped being acknowledged the moment institutions were built that had the power to decide what real things were. François Arago was the director of the Paris Observatory from 1843 until his death in 1853. He is in the history books. He discovered the phenomenon of magnetic rotation. He made foundational contributions to optics and electromagnetism. He was, by any measure, one of the most significant scientists of the 19th century. He also spent more than 20 years mapping the surface of Venus. Not the clouds, the surface, what he described as continental divisions, stable dark regions with defined boundaries, features that maintained their positions across months of observation and through independent confirmation by his assistants. The modern explanation for this is that Arago was observing cloud formations and mistaking them for surface features. Here is the problem with that explanation. Cloud formations on Venus change. They don't maintain consistent shapes across months of observation. They don't have defined boundaries that hold stable under repeated measurement. They don't appear in the same positions when observed by different people using different instruments from different locations. Venus's atmosphere is among the most dynamic in the solar system. The clouds circulate in under 5 Earth days. What Arago documented doesn't behave like clouds. It behaves like surface features. And yet the official explanation is clouds, not because the cloud explanation is more consistent with the observational data, but because the alternative explanation is that Arago was accurately observing a Venus that modern probes have not confirmed, which would mean something about Venus changed, or something about the way we look at Venus changed. One of those possibilities gets discussed, one of them doesn't. In 1978, a retired optical engineer named Theodore Carlson published a paper in an obscure amateur astronomy journal. The paper argued that human vision is not a passive receiver of light. It actively filters incoming visual data through neurological patterns established through training and expectation, and that those filters become measurably stronger the more formalized the training is. Carlson's background made this more than theoretical. He had spent 30 years designing optical systems for military reconnaissance. During the Second World War, he had worked on training aerial photo interpreters, teaching analysts to identify camouflaged installations from high-altitude imagery. He discovered that interpreters trained on one camouflage pattern became systematically blind to different patterns, even when those patterns were clearly visible in the photographs. The brain, trained to find one kind of signal, suppressed other kinds, not through inattention, through neurological filtering. His argument was that the same effect explained the post-1880 disappearance of anomalous astronomical observations. Before standardized training, astronomers had no established filters. They drew whatever appeared in the eyepiece. After standardized training became universal, training that told observers specifically what the moon was dead, what Mars was barren, what Venus was cloud-bound and unobservable, they had neural pathways that automatically reconciled incoming data with the expected image. The planets didn't change, the instruments didn't change, the observers' brains changed. Carlson's paper was ignored by mainstream astronomy. He never published in a major journal. He died in 1983. His work is referenced only in a handful of sources that are themselves difficult to verify. The disappearance of Carlson's research is not the most significant part of this story. But it is the most instructive part, because what Carlson described is not speculative. The psychology is well documented. In 1999, researchers at Harvard demonstrated that people counting basketball passes completely failed to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene, not because they weren't looking, but because their attention had been deliberately channeled toward a specific task, and everything outside that task became invisible. Radiologists examining chest X-rays for tumors missed an image of a gorilla digitally inserted into the scan at the size of a matchbook. Experts, with lives potentially on the line, seeing only what their training had told them to look for. Now imagine that effect applied not to a single experiment, but to a professional discipline, applied systematically, through curricula and journals and professional credentials, over the course of a century. What would the observations look like after 100 years of that? They would look exactly like what modern astronomy shows us. There's a point this video opened toward and has been building toward for everything that has followed. It has to do with the Gruithuisen paper, not its contents, its fate. Gruithuisen, published in 1824. The paper was accepted. It was taken seriously. Other astronomers confirmed aspects of what he described. It entered the scientific record as a legitimate observation by a credentialed scientist using a quality instrument. Then, sometime in the late 19th century, it ceased to exist as a living part of the scientific conversation. Not because someone proved it wrong, because the infrastructure that would have kept it alive, the journals that might have published follow-up observations, the societies that might have organized comparative studies, the training programs that might have told students, this observation is part of the record you need to engage with, was built after 1880 by people who had already decided what the solar system looked like. The paper is still there. You can find it. The observatory records that supported it are still there, in archives, in several countries. The observation journals of the astronomers who confirmed Gruithuysen's findings are still there, in institutions that preserve them as historical curiosities. Nobody formally said these observations were wrong. They just stopped being part of the conversation that mattered. And a scientific finding that stops being part of the conversation is, for practical purposes, the same as a scientific finding that never happened. That is how you erase 50 years of documented observation without leaving fingerprints. You don't refute it. You simply build the future of the field around a different assumption and let the record that contradicts that assumption quietly become irrelevant. What you should do with this information is not what most content in this space wants you to do with it. Most content in this space wants you to believe that the moon has structures, that Mars was civilized, that the truth is being hidden from you by people with power who want you docile and uninformed. That's not this video's argument. This video's argument is narrower and, if you take it seriously, more disturbing. The argument is that, between 1880 and 1895, a set of institutions was built that fundamentally changed what counted as a real astronomical observation, and that the 50 years of documented, peer-reviewed, independently confirmed observations that preceded those institutions were not engaged with, not refuted, not disproved, but simply abandoned by the field that those institutions came to control. That's not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination and secrets. What happened to the pre-1880 observation record didn't require either of those things. It only required institutions with the power to define validity and a professional culture that had every incentive to defer to those definitions, because the careers of every astronomer in the following century depended on institutions that had already decided what the solar system looked like. The question that this should leave you with, and that this video cannot answer, because it's a question that would require a separate and much longer reckoning, is not about the moon or Mars or Venus. It's about the mechanism itself. If this happened in astronomy, if 50 years of documented observation by the most credentialed scientists of their era could be institutionally abandoned without refutation in a discipline that prides itself on evidence and reproducibility, What does that tell us about the reliability of any scientific consensus that was built by institutions that had the power to decide what evidence counted? That's not a comfortable question. It's also not a question you were likely to encounter anywhere else today. The instruments are still out there, some of them, in museums, in private collections, in the basements of European observatories that have had them for 150 years and have no particular reason to dust them off. The observation journals are still there. The drawings are still there. The published papers are still there, including the Gruithuisen paper, sitting in exactly the same place it has always been, formally unrebutted, simply uncited. Nobody came for them with a truck. They didn't need to. All they needed was for the next generation of astronomers to be trained by people who had already decided those observations were not worth looking at. And that is a much more effective kind of erasure. The next video on this channel goes somewhere that connects directly to what you just heard. Not the telescopes, but the broader pattern they represent, how official knowledge gets constructed, and what happens to the people who document things the construction doesn't have room for. If that question is the one you're sitting with right now, that video is where it leads next. If this video did what it was supposed to do, you're not looking at the sky quite the same way you were 40 minutes ago. Good. Now tell me where I'm wrong.